Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Nicole Cunningham, and I am the Abuse Prevention Coordinator at the Oregon Attorney General's Sexual Assault Task Force, and my pronouns are she and hers.
And I'm Nicole Broder. I'm the same coordinator at the Oregon Sexual Assault Task Force, and my pronouns are she, her, or they, them.
We are so excited to have you here today to walk through a resource that we've been working on and an adaptation that we've made to it to try and meet a broader range of needs. The resource we're going to be diving into today is going to start with walking through a case example where we were looking at how oppression was showing up in an example of child abuse. And then we will walk through a worksheet that was created to walk alongside that resource to help folks think about how oppression is showing up in their own cases.
And as a final part of our recording today, I'll be talking a little bit about a healthcare specific version of the worksheet that we created with a few extra pointers for SANEs who may be using this to evaluate their own work and the way that systems of oppression present in healthcare in particular.
Before we get going here, I'd like to give you all just a little bit of context about how we got here and what prompted us to create this resource in the first place. So as I mentioned, I'm Nicole Cunningham, Abuse Prevention Coordinator for the task force. And in my role, I work to bridge the gap between child abuse prevention efforts and broader violence and abuse prevention efforts in the state, including things like sexual and domestic violence. Prior to coming to this role, however, I was a CPS, Child Protective Services caseworker for the state of Oregon. And really, the main drive behind creating a resource like this was to take some time to think about the experiences I'd had and start imagining how I can shift my perspective to think about oppression and prevention rather than only being in response mode, which was where I was at as a caseworker. So now we're going to go ahead and get to the resource. All right, folks. So this is the cover page of this resource that you'll see when you first click into it to get it open. And I want to just give you a little context here for what you'll find. Essentially, this resource started out as just this case example that you'll see as we walk through this first part. But we added the worksheet as a secondary resource to really help expand on the work that was done in this first case example. So as you'll see here, there's a little bit of explanation about how we got here, how we developed these resources, and then some ideas about how to use this resource. The next part here is page 1 of the actual case example, and this will just be that first page as you get into the packet. So what we have here on this first page is obviously, first, we started with a little bit of an introduction. For anyone who is listening to this right now, please note that as you read through the content of this case example, there are references to things like domestic violence, child sexual abuse, and some other topics that can be pretty heavy and difficult. Obviously, we're talking about oppression. So I do want to give that caveat for folks just to take care of yourself as you're going through this resource and to note that that is extended here as well so that we can share that information with others who might be accessing this resource. The next part here that you'll see is a little bit of conversation about how to use this resource. Ideally, we had initially started this as a way to think about oppression as it was showing up in examples of child abuse. That, however, really that really expanded for us when we started realizing that this approach to considering oppression really was something that we had the ability to apply to a lot of different areas, not just child abuse. And so we tried to walk through that here a little bit in this first section, thinking about some different ideas of how we can use this resource, other areas where folks might find value in it. And then we tried to give a little bit of context here about what folks could expect as you walk through the case example. As you'll see, there's a vignette here that we're going to start with that will explain what happened in the case, and we'll talk a little bit about the different components of that. I'm not going to go into all the details of the actual case example in this recording, but I will give you some pieces of why we chose certain information and why it was important to include. The next section, as you'll see here, is a conversation about what types of abuse, neglect, and violence were present in the scenario. And we'll come back to that. But really, the intention here is to highlight the connectedness between what might be familiar to us, things like sexual violence or physical abuse, rather than only talking in terms of oppression. And so we wanted to link those things together. The next section that we're going to talk about is an examination of how oppression was present in the case example. And we'll talk about how we started looking at this through 3 different lenses that we'll come back to as we get to that section. And the last piece here explains that we've got some resources at the end here for continued learning and for safety and well-being, especially since we did mention that this is some kind of sensitive, difficult information for folks. So, okay, let's go ahead and jump in. So the first part that you're going to see here is what we're calling our case example vignette. And this really outlines what happened in the scenario. This I will note, and it's important for anyone who might be considering how to utilize this resource. We were very, very intentional about being sure that we were not identifying anyone in this resource and that we were taking out any information that would have been, confidential or that could have violated any kind of policy or law that would have been shared. So definitely we anonymized this. This case example is actually compiled from multiple different experiences in the field of child welfare and gave us a really great opportunity to add in some different dimensions that were important to think about. A few of those that we want to be sure to highlight are over here in this orange box that you'll see at the top up here. We thought it was important to capture some demographic information about folks. In this example, we have things listed like, father, Joe was the father, he was male, he was cisgender, heterosexual, and Caucasian and Latinx. These pieces were important for us to capture because we know that there's a lot of nuance that comes with those intersectional identities that folks have and that they carry with them into their experiences. And so we want to also make a note down here. In this case example, right, we talked about the actual abuse that happened and concerns, about kiddos coming into foster care or not. There's some conversation here about supports they had, but what's not listed here, because it's impossible to capture all of the different pieces that contribute to an experience of violence or abuse that happens within a family, right? Or within any situation, if we're being honest. So this additional factors box down here was really crucial in capturing some of the other stressors that the family was experiencing to highlight that there were more nuanced pieces going on outside of just whatever experience we saw, right? So here you'll see things like talking about having difficulty finding and maintaining employment, concerns about social isolation, gender and sexuality questions for one of the youth in the family, along with some other stressors that were impacting and that had a role in what happened and the climate around what happened for the family. The last thing that's important to note on this page is the language caveat that is down here. We have really been intentional in this document with trying to think about the connotation of words like kids or minor or, alleged victim if we're talking about the ways our systems respond, because we know that there's connotation attached to those words and that oftentimes when we use words like child or minor, we are implying and reinforcing that ageism or adultism that's often present when we think about the ways that youth are approached or considered in their experiences, especially when they've experienced something like violence or abuse and then have to interact with systems. So we made a note there, and then it's also important to note that we highlighted the pronouns. This is obviously something that we think is crucial to creating a climate that's more accepting and that's safer for all folks. So that's the first page here and how we structured our case example. The next page here is going to start making some of those connections for us. So at the top, this yellow section highlights some of the different forms of abuse and violence that were actually present in the situation. So we broke it down. There were concerns for sexual abuse, there were concerns for mental and emotional abuse, and then also for neglect. And once again, these pieces felt really important to us in the child abuse world to be able to connect not only the actual concepts that we work with, but the language that we use. And so this is a place where, this is something that may or may not be applicable to all disciplines. This may not be the approach that you find the most value in, and it might be, right? There might be value there in connecting the actual experience that someone had with oppression. So keep that in mind that this resource can be, there are parts and pieces of it that might fit you, and there are parts and pieces that may not. So for this first one, though, it definitely made sense for us to connect forms of violence and abuse, especially thinking about how we, in the child abuse world that I came from, how we talk about the experiences that folks have. This was crucial for us when it came to being able to make connections back to the forms of oppression that we identify on the next page. So down here on the second half of this page, you will notice a blue box. This blue box really just kind of cues you up for what's to come. It explains that we've got 4 tables that are upcoming that we're going to look at 4 different forms of oppression. In this case, we highlighted ableism, adultism and ageism, classism, and racism. It also explains that we are going to be using 3 different lenses to think about oppression: how oppression was a root cause for the parent's behavior, how the parent used this form of oppression to perpetrate violence, abuse, or neglect, and then how our systems reinforced oppression in the scenario. Additionally, we were really intentional based on the feedback that we got from our partners as we were developing this resource. We were intentional in trying to include some historical context pieces when we're looking at oppression, because we believe that it's important to think about where we came from to understand how we got here, right? And we also, have to be thinking about those historical pieces to be sure that we're not assuming that folks are experiencing violence or abuse in like an isolated moment, right? We know that there are lots of different things that combine and contribute to folks' experience of violence and abuse. And if we're discounting the historical pieces or things like intergenerational trauma, experiences that folks, their parents, their grandparents, their ancestors had, then we're losing a whole piece of this picture of what makes someone who they are and why they are in a situation that they're in to begin with, right? So the historical context was really important for us to make sure that we're not losing those pieces of what's contributing to the climate that allows violence and abuse to flourish. The last piece here is just a little caveat that this resource, yes, we are going to be thinking about how our systems are reinforcing oppression. We are not trying to attack anybody or have this come off, like people aren't doing their jobs, or we know that there's nuance in the way that this work happens. And we know that there are barriers when it comes to how we work with folks, how we show up and are able to do the work, which doesn't always align with how we want to do the work, right? So we wanted to be transparent about that down here, that we know that there are, that this resource it's possible that it might bring up big feelings, and we don't want that to derail folks from being able to have thoughtful and honest conversations about what does this larger systemic oppression look like, not just how are we as individuals, considering our role in either intentionally, unintentionally reinforcing harm or not. So we just wanted a little bit of that discussion down here. Okay, so on this page, we are going to look at our first form of oppression, which in this example is ableism. And what I want to do is just walk you through the format of this table and what you can expect to see here, because this is what you'll see for the next 3 pages as well, as we look through some of the other forms of oppression that we're looking at in this resource. So up here at the top of this table, you have the actual form of oppression along with a definition. So this one, like I said, is ableism. And then right below that, we have some historical context. And these bullet points here are not meant to be comprehensive, right? We didn't go into a discussion of each of these things here, but we did try to highlight some of the pieces for further learning that you'll see at the end of this resource. There's a section on resources where you can then spend a little bit more time thinking about some of the concepts that we've highlighted here, especially as we mentioned, that piece of understanding where we came from to understand where we are feels crucial to understanding the real depth of oppression that's experienced in these examples. So here what we'll see in this first box on the left, this is the first of 3 different lenses that we used to think about how oppression was showing up in this case example. So on the one here, we started with how was this form of oppression, so in this example, how was ableism a root cause for the parent's behavior, and how did ableism empower the parent to cause the harm that was caused? And please keep in mind that, the word parent is used here in this particular example, but we know that this could be a caregiver or an acquaintance or, someone else, whoever is the person who's caused harm. We don't have to stick with the frame of the parent, especially if that doesn't apply to the example that you're looking at. So here in this column, you'll see an explanation of different ways that ableism was showing up in how the father in the scenario who caused harm, how he, thought about ability, how he talked about it, what experiences he might have had with it. And really the goal here is to understand what brings someone to a point where they have learned or developed some ideas that tell them that they should value somebody less based on something like their ability, right? The second section here is thinking about how the parent, in this case the father, how they used this form of oppression, so ableism, to perpetrate violence, abuse, and or neglect. And in this explanation here, we really looked at how those ideas, those internalized beliefs about ability played into the way that the father in the scenario used power, used control, used language, used isolation, different tactics like that would be attached to ableism, attached to ability, and ingrained in him the understanding of this gives me power, right? This is something that I can use as a way to control or cause harm. And then the last section here was thinking about how did our systems reinforce oppression in the scenario? So in this example, how did our systems that interacted with the young person and the family, how did our systems reinforce ableism or possibly unintentionally reinforce harm, that was maybe not noticed or maybe not clear right there on the surface to folks like the caseworker who responded or law enforcement or, healthcare systems, anyone who was interacting with this family in this scenario. The last section here that I want to point to is this box down here that talks about how prevention efforts could have changed or impacted the situation. Something that felt really important to us was highlighting that there are prevention efforts that could possibly have had an impact at different levels. And I want to just give a brief little description here of what primary, secondary, and tertiary mean, just in case anyone who is watching this maybe isn't familiar with those terms, or you might be more familiar with the terms upstream, midstream, and downstream, which correspond to the same topic that we're discussing here. But when we're talking about primary prevention, we're talking about the prevention efforts that really exist to stop violence and abuse from happening in the first place. These are the ones that are meant to change, norms, are meant to change supports, to provide resources, really the things that are there to get people what they need so that they don't experience our response systems in the first place, right? Secondary prevention efforts, when we're talking about secondary, we often refer to this as places where we can maybe change the trajectory or the path that somebody is on. We think about this in terms of how can we maybe make some kind of change for someone who might be at risk of experiencing harm or perpetrating harm. And then lastly, this tertiary idea is how do we prevent harm from happening again to somebody, right? This is more what you see when we're looking at response systems, folks who are doing things like providing mental health care or, trauma recovery services. These are folks who are doing the work to be sure that we are not experiencing harm again and making sure that we can work towards healing or whatever that looks like for somebody after they've experienced violence or abuse. So with that said, we did go through and try to list out some different efforts that could have possibly made an impact or changed the situation at all three of those different levels. This felt really important to us because we don't only want to focus, when we're thinking about prevention, we don't only want to focus on what we don't want people to do, right? We want to replace it with what's healthy, what's positive, what we want folks to do. And so we tried to offer some ideas here about how we could have changed the outcomes in this situation. And we'll do this for each of the following forms of oppression as well. The last thing down here, we just wanted to make a caveat that we know that a lot of prevention efforts actually overlap between those levels and that it's not always as clear cut as this person or this effort, this strategy was primary prevention only, right? We know that sometimes an effort might be primary and secondary. There's times where these efforts can bleed across those different levels. And we wanted to be cognizant of that and name that. That way we're not putting ourselves in boxes where we're not able to see the full scope of the impact that our efforts might have. Okay, so I won't walk through each of these in too much detail, given that we walked through the format on that last slide. So what I'll do though is highlight the different forms of oppression that we identified here. So the next one that we are looking at is ageism and adultism. And again, we have all those same discussions about some historical context, those three different lenses of how oppression was utilized. And then once again, thinking about prevention efforts across those three different levels. And that's what you'll see as well on the next two. So we've got classism, and the last one that we identified is racism. And these four were chosen because of the specific example, but we know that there are many different forms of oppression that we could have talked about in this situation. For example, you'll see on the first page, or that case example page that's orange at the beginning there, how we highlighted that there was some conversation about gender, sexuality, those different identity pieces for one of the young folks. And we easily could have added another one of these tables to think about how things like cissexism or, these different gender pieces or identity pieces were showing up. And we didn't want to overwhelm this resource, right? So don't look at this and think that, if you're identifying something else, if something else is coming up for you as you're reading this, trust your gut, right? Maybe you're right there in understanding a piece of oppression that we didn't highlight or that we didn't call out, and know that we could probably have 5, 6, 7 pages for each of the different experiences that we're having with folks, because we know that there's so much that goes into creating a climate that allows violence and abuse to flourish. So we just wanted to note that this is not fully comprehensive. There are pieces here that we could add, and that's part of the benefit of a resource like this, right? Is that we can expand on it and we can think more creatively without getting stuck in a place that we're assuming that we've covered all of our bases, right? Okay, so with that being said, let's move into the next section here. And this is going to take us to pretty close to the end of this first part of the resource. So we have resources and tools for next steps and continuing the conversation section here. Because of the kinds of oppression we identified, we tried to be really thoughtful about what resources might be helpful for continued learning. We highlighted anti-racism because we identified racism as one of the forms of oppression. And we know that anti-racism work is crucial, right? We know that if we are addressing racism, then we are impacting violence and abuse in all of its different forms. And as a result, also impacting the experience of oppression that folks have when it intersects with other kinds of oppression, right? So racism feels foundational. It feels like one that we have to always be centering race when we're thinking about the lenses that we're using as we're discussing oppression, right? So that was why we focused so heavily on anti-racism here. And then on the next page, you'll see that we really tried to be comprehensive in linking to some of these different places where we can explore the historical context. This really is absolutely one of the main things that we want folks to get out of this resource is the understanding that these experiences of violence and abuse and oppression as it manifests, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? These things don't just pop up because someone woke up one day and said, I'm going to choose to be racist today, or I'm going to go out there and, I have a problem with people who are disabled, or I've got a problem with folks who are, whatever ethnic minority group. We know that folks don't just wake up with those ideas, right? They're learned. They're things that are passed down and that are inherited through different experiences, through our media, through the messages we receive. And one of the things that is crucial is understanding our history so that we can really see there is so much to be done in terms of unpacking and being sure that we're honoring the experiences of those who came before us as well. So this felt really important to us that we're providing these resources. And then lastly, here we have a section that has some additional tools that SATF has created. We just wanted to be able to provide folks with more resources, more tools, more ways to think about these topics. And then on the last page here is our safety and well-being section. So, we have a lot of different things listed here, like domestic and sexual violence resources, trans lifeline, deaf hotline, different places that we tried to seek support. And then we left a blank space down here at the request of our community members who gave us feedback on this resource, because we reached out to a ton of folks, right? This resource was informed by so many people across the state, and primarily in our prevention and education committee, where we've got folks who are, excuse me, we've got folks in our prevention education subcommittee who are representing like prevention efforts, who are educators, folks who are working at statewide levels, folks in the community level. There are people from all over Oregon and from all different disciplines who have had eyes on this resource. And we heard loud and clear that it would be helpful to have a place to put community resources, right? Local community resources that folks could plug in to really be sure that they're not only speaking to the statewide nature of this resource, but the more intimate reach that it might have. All right, thank you so much for listening for this first part here as we went through the case example. Okay, so now that we've walked through that first case example and given you some context about how we got here and why we got here, the next piece of this is going to be walking through a worksheet that we've developed to help folks walk through their own case examples. So one thing I want to highlight before we get into this resource, or the worksheet, excuse me, is that this example and this exercise is meant to be able to be applied to disciplines outside of the child abuse field. We really wanted to create a tool that would take this experience of breaking down a case and thinking about how oppression was showing up and make it feel accessible for folks who are outside of the child abuse field, even folks who maybe don't, directly work with domestic and sexual violence either, right? We're thinking about folks in the healthcare field. We're thinking about law enforcement. We're thinking about advocates, folks all over the state who are doing work with people and who need a way to think critically about how oppression might be showing up in the work they're doing and how we might be unintentionally reinforcing it. So we are going to go ahead and move into the worksheet portion, and I'll start with giving you an overview of the original worksheet that we created, and then we'll bring back Nicole Broder, who will talk with us a little bit about some of the adaptations that have been made for the same community. Okay, so now that we've walked through our initial case example, what we're going to do is walk through this worksheet that's actually set up to take us through the same process that was utilized to develop that resource, so that folks can start working on thinking about how you could frame your own experiences, and how you might adapt this to be useful for you in your community. So this worksheet starts out with a little section here that is really intended to help us ground ourselves in this worksheet before we get going, right? So you'll see here that we're asking for a little bit of information from you. What sector do you work in? What's your role? What is the general purpose of your role as defined by your agency? But really the most important question here is, what do you personally think of as a goal of your work with your clients, patients, etc.? This will be crucial as we come back to kind of circling around at the end of the worksheet. So don't skip this question if you're, kind of thinking about what may or may not be necessary. This goal piece is going to be helpful in grounding us and bringing us back at the end. So we highly recommend that you take a few minutes to think here about what is a goal of the work for you. The next section here is going to ask us to take a little time to recall your case example that you want to work from. So in this exercise, you're going to want to choose a client who experienced violence or abuse as a precursor to working with you. Obviously, if we don't have an experience where someone has experienced violence or abuse, it's going to be harder for us to connect oppression back to that person's experiences, because we know that oftentimes oppression manifests as violence, right? And that doesn't always have to be physical violence, but it's helpful for us if we start from a place of some kind of violence or abuse. That way we can make connections as we work backwards, thinking about how we got here in terms of the case example that you've chosen. There are a few things that are really important for us to note here. The first one is, obviously, we don't want anyone getting in trouble for sharing information that's sensitive, confidential, that would violate HIPAA, any of those things, right? So please be super careful with this exercise, that you are taking care to anonymize, change details, combine experiences, whatever it takes to be sure that this information is protected and that we're not violating anyone's confidentiality rights by working through this experience, especially if you're planning on sharing this with a colleague or your team, or you're working together as a collaborative model or anything along those lines. The next piece that we wanted to note here is this language note. So again, we wanted to make this resource accessible to folks in all different disciplines. And so we wanted to note here that you will have some language that we'd like to encourage you to think of as interchangeable with whatever it is that makes sense to you in your field, right? So we use the word client here to represent the person served, but that could be your patient, your client, the survivor, victim, customer, whatever it looks like or sounds like to you in your line of work. We also want to note that we use the words violence or abuse to describe harm, and case to describe the experience working with the client. We also, once again, encourage that creativity in thinking about how that language actually applies to you, regardless of whether or not you use those exact words. The next section here is where we're going to start trying to think about some of the identity pieces that were brought to the table in this experience. So you'll see two different boxes here. The blue box up here at the top is going to be thinking about the client who experienced harm. This is where we are going to start trying to outline some of the different factors that make up the identity pieces that help dictate how your client experiences the world, or how the world experiences your client. So this is things like race, sexual orientation, ability, age, criminal justice history, language spoken, ethnicity, immigration status, and then we know that there are probably others, right, that we didn't think of here. So we wanted to leave some space for flexibility. This is crucial because we can't effectively think about the oppression that someone is experiencing if we don't understand the things that they're bringing with them to the table, right? We know that if we are only looking at a client in terms of, what their experience was, or how they presented, or, what injuries they had, or, what their long-term ramifications are going to be of this experience, we're really focused on the moment, right? The right here and now, the situation that has landed at our doorstep. But what's really important with this exercise is being more critical our assumptions, right? And working backwards to think about what that person brought to the table with them. What are they carrying with them in terms of how they walk through the world, and how there might be barriers, things that they might have to overcome, challenges, and also strengths that they have, right? These are really important aspects of people and things that we need to honor and be cognizant of when we're working with them, to really be sure we're getting a whole experience of a person if possible. The next piece here is, because it's not technically a box, but this white section is going to ask us to do the same thing, but this time we're thinking about the person who caused the client harm. And so here we want to think about, the exact same things: their race, their sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, gender, all these things that you would hopefully, that you may or may not know, right, about the person who caused harm, but that you might have gotten through conversation with your client, or through paperwork that was filled out, or through, just the experience of interacting with that person. Maybe you've worked with them when it comes to, contacting families, or maybe you've interacted with that person through the law enforcement system as a result of whatever happened, right? So this is a place to really think about the person who caused harm in the same way that we're thinking about our client, right? The person who experienced harm. One thing that we want to do down here is just be sure that we're noting that we know that you might not have this information, right? This is stuff that we really have to ask for oftentimes, because there are a lot of things that folks experience that are negative as they're related to their identities, right? So when we're thinking about things like racism, sexism, ageism, religionism, all that stuff, it may not be something that folks are actively trying to give you this information. And so we know that there are times that you're not going to have this kind of information, or that you might not have been able to get through the depth of conversation, or not have had the time that would be necessary to be able to gather this. So we wanted to pose some questions if you find yourself in a position where you don't have this information, to continue our thinking, right? So these are questions like, what is the impact of identifying or not identifying this type of information when you're working with your clients? We want to be sure that we're not giving ourselves essentially a cop-out, right? Where just because we don't have this information doesn't mean that we don't need to be thinking about these things. And how can we be more thoughtful in thinking about what we do have, and what information we don't have, and what that means, right? So you'll see a few questions down here, like what might change about the way that you provide your services if you know these things, or if you don't know them. And then this is also a really great example to consider the power and privilege that you hold simply by being in a position where you are able to think about someone else's experience in this way, right? Having the power and the ability to look at someone's life and think about them as a person who we can break down into gender, language, immigration status, all these pieces that we can essentially fill out these blocks. That in itself is a privilege, right? Having access to that information, and having the ability to cause harm, or to use that information responsibly, right? All those things are privileges. And so we're hoping that this is also a time that folks might take a minute and reflect on just the power that you hold by having the ability to walk through this page in this resource with us. Okay, so this next piece here is going to build on page 2. So I might flip back to that last screen as we're chatting here. So what we want to do here is start thinking about some of the stereotypes and biases that exist in regard to the identity factors that you identified here. So this is things like, what do you know about, what have you been taught about someone based on their race, or their sexual orientation, or their religion, or their gender, right? What things in society, what stereotypes, what biases, what messages have we learned? And this is a place where we're going to ask folks to be really honest, right? We're asking you to come to this page of this worksheet knowing that this is going to be difficult. This is not going to feel good to sit here and outline stereotypes and biases that exist, and to think of, to think about folks in a way that might feel hurtful or harmful, right? So we're asking you to be thoughtful as you're going through this, especially if you are, working with a team or you're doing this collaboratively. Just know that this might be a sensitive area, and we're asking you to show up with the most authentic, transparent, and comprehensive approach that you can, right? Like if you can come to this and be as honest with yourself as possible, we're going to get a lot more out of this discussion than if we, try to pretend like there aren't stereotypes and biases that exist in our society. We know there are, right? We know that there are attitudes, ideas, beliefs, norms, all that stuff is out there. So let's talk about it. Let's think about what we've identified on this page, what kinds of things we know about these things, and then we'll use that information as we go forward, right? Um, so yes, take some time here when you get to this page and just think honestly, think critically, and be as truthful with yourself as you can be. Okay, so now that we have spent a little bit of time on the previous page thinking about what we think we know, or what the world tells us about certain identity factors, we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about the violence or abuse that actually occurred in the case example that you've chosen. So up here, we're going to ask you to think about the client and think about what they experienced. Something that can be really helpful at times is looking through power and control wheels, especially if you're not familiar with always being able to name or verbalize the different kinds of violence and abuse that occur. So we have 4 different links here that we want to be sure that folks are, accessing. And please note that at the end of this, just a little scrolling warning for folks. I'm going to scroll for a moment. So if it makes you motion sick, go ahead and look away. But you'll see at the end of this resource that we have included 2 of the power and control wheels here for quick access. That way you don't have to go hunting them down if you're, pressed for time, or if you've already printed this resource and have it there in front of you. Okay, so now that we're back here, this is a place where you can just outline some of those different ways that violence and abuse are present. So things like physical abuse, emotional abuse, financial, sexual, trafficking, all those different things that you might have seen in the experience that your client had. Okay, so now that we've taken a little time here to think about the different forms of violence and abuse that were present, now we want to come back to thinking about the stereotypes and biases that were identified on page 3 as you were looking at, what do we think we know, or what have we been taught about certain identity factors. And this first section here is just a quick little overview of what we're talking about when we're talking about oppression. You'll see here that there is a little example that was shared with us from our colleagues at the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. The definition they gave us is this: oppression is the systematic and pervasive mistreatment of individuals on the basis of their membership in a disadvantaged group. It involves an imbalance in power and one group benefiting from the systemic exploitation of other groups. So that's where we're going next. We're going to be moving into talking about oppression as it relates to violence and abuse. One thing that can be helpful is thinking about this equation here, this harmful ideas and norms, plus the use of power and control as it equals oppression and marginalization. We also have here a little pyramid that we call the pyramid of violence. And this illustrates for us the ways that oppression actually builds and manifests, right? It starts with things like language. It starts with jokes. It starts with how we talk about people and what ideas we allow to exist without challenging them, or, how we are talking about or thinking about folks when we're in our day-to-day lives, right? It starts here at this level. The next piece is, moving into discrimination. This is this language operationalized, right? This is where we start to see folks actually having barriers put up based on their identity factors, where they're not having as easy of access to people who don't have the same identity factors that are causing those barriers for them. We often see that then escalate to physical violence, to hate crimes, and ultimately to genocide. And this is why it's so important that we're talking about oppression now, because we know that we've been here, right? We've been here as a society, and we know that all of this exists, and that we have to think about how are we combating these things at each level. The last piece that I want to highlight here is this socio-ecological model that is set up to help you kind of conceptualize the fact that we know oppression is present at multiple different levels, right? So we have the individual, the relationship level, community, institutional, and societal levels here. And we know that oppression can be present in any of those situations. And that also means that we can impact oppression at any of those levels, right? We can implement prevention efforts, or we can do things to change the impact that oppression has. But first, we have to understand how it shows up and how it's built on, how it gains power, and how it shapes itself when it comes to our systems of control. Okay, so with that said, we're going to move to the next page here. This one is one of my favorite pages, actually, and I'm really excited to share it with you. So here we're talking about making some connections between oppression and violence and abuse. And so we wanted to give you a few examples to begin with, right? So that we could do a little thinking about this before we just jump into your actual case example. So here you'll see a little example that we came up with. In this instance, it revolves around mental health concerns and a partner who is not emotionally supportive of their partner and their mental health needs. And so we wanted to illustrate here the ways that ableism turns into emotional abuse, and then also give you some questions to think about some of those more nuanced levels, rather than just, explaining, well, this can become this. Great, we know that. And now what if you knew this, right? What if you knew that there was another level? What if you knew that there were other things that were compounding and interacting and influencing the way that this person experiences the world, or the way the world experiences this person, right? And so you have two examples here, one, with this mental health concern, and then one down here that's a concern for a houseless person who experienced police violence based on racism, and the way that it culminated with their experience of houselessness. And so in this one, we wanted to highlight, like I said, how racism, classism become police violence. And then also wanted to think about, what if we think about these other levels, like this long history of redlining that, could have made housing unaffordable for this houseless person, and thinking about how these different levels make the experience of oppression more nuanced, and what we're missing if we're not thinking about the other levels, right? If we're just thinking about what's right in front of us and we're not considering the other identities, the other experiences that people bring with them, we're missing a huge part of understanding that person in the full picture, which does a disservice to them and to us, honestly, if we're trying to move the work forward. So with that being said, we will move into this next section here, which is often a place that can be a little bit more difficult to think about. This is one of the more complicated sections in this worksheet. So this is where we're starting to think about, if you think back to those tables that I showed you in the first section of this recording, where you had those 4 different forms of oppression, and we looked at them in terms of how is oppression a root cause? How is the parent utilizing oppression to as a tool to perpetrate harm? And then how was oppression reinforced by our response systems? So this page is set up to try to get at those first 2 questions. How was oppression a root cause for the behaviors? And then how did the person who caused the harm utilize oppression? So here we are going to ask you to come back to thinking about your own case example. We're coming back to, the client that we've been thinking about their identities. We've been thinking about stereotypes. We've been thinking about the violence they experienced. So come back there and think first here about this first lens, how was oppression a root cause for the behaviors of the person who caused harm? This one may not be very obvious unless you've had a lot of time to really sit down and talk this through, or a lot about the background of the person you're working with, the person you're providing services and supports to, because oftentimes people who have oppressive values and norms and ideas in their heads are secretive about it, right? Folks don't often walk around just yelling, I'm a racist, or I have an issue with mental health. Those kinds of things are not often put on display, at least not for the majority of society, I would say. And so what we want to do here is try and identify some of the harmful ideas and attitudes about your client's identity factors that the person who caused harm held, right? So for example, let's say you identified that your client is Latinx. And let's say that they experienced physical abuse from a partner in a relationship, right? And let's say that for the purposes of this piece here, this question of what harmful ideas and attitudes, I could understand that this person maybe has prejudice or bias against a person of Latinx descent if maybe that person was saying things to your client like, go back to where you came from, or, you don't belong here, or, speak English, right? Like different things that give little glimmers of ideology, of values, beliefs that are held. Those are the kinds of things that we want to try and capture here. And this may also be more obvious, right? It might be your client saying, he told me no one was going to believe me because I have mental health issues. This could be your client saying, I am homeless, and for that reason, I knew that I couldn't access supports. This could be, they might say, I practice a religion that my partner or, the person who caused me harm is not comfortable with. And so, in that regard, they may tell you that there are oppressive ideas that that were held by the person who caused them harm. And if those things are obvious, then great, that's super helpful, right? And if they're not, we wanted to create some different pieces down here that might help illustrate some of the ways that folks show their oppressive ideas without verbalizing I'm racist or I'm sexist, right? So some of that might look like she's crazy. I don't listen to anything she says because she's nuts. If we're thinking about someone who is voicing ableist viewpoints, he's just a kid. I know what's best for him regardless of what he says. This is an example of adultism. So there's a few examples down here that can help us think about how the person who caused harm was showing their oppressive ideas or values, right? The second piece here, actually, excuse me, I want to come back for a second. I really think it's important to highlight this question here. If you don't have this information, use this space to think about how not having this information may have impacted your work with your client. This feels crucial to me because the reality is that if we don't understand the dynamics that allowed for somebody to experience harm in the first place, we're always going to be missing something, right? And that's not saying that we're not doing our job. That's not saying that we're not getting the information that we need to be able to do our work. But what it is saying is that there's a deeper piece of a bigger picture that is missing if we don't understand what prompted somebody to cause harm in the first place, right? The second piece here is this idea of how did the person who caused the harm utilize oppression to harm your patient or your client? So this here is a little more straightforward, right? This is things like, how did they tie their abuse, their harm to identity factors? So maybe they isolated the person. Maybe they, physically abuse them because the person, maybe your client has a disability, right? And maybe their partner was physically abusive to them because they knew that they had power in that way, right? Maybe there's financial abuse. Maybe there's blatant racism happening. There's a whole bunch of different ways that this can show up, right? But oftentimes you're going to get more of this when you're talking with your client because they're more likely to explain to you the kinds of experiences they had rather than being able to explain why those things happened to them, if that makes sense. So here they might, give you examples of what someone said and did. And those are the kinds of things that we can use when we're thinking about those actions and those words as tools, right? How can we tie them back to ideas, norms, ideologies, beliefs, values to help understand their power and their weight as tools to cause harm? So there's a few pieces down here to consider just as you're going through this. We want to be sure that we're thinking about intention and impact, right? Not just, well, what did they mean to do or what actually happened? We want to look at both. We also want to encourage folks to think back to the resources provided on page 3, which is those power and control wheels. If you're having any kind of difficulty with identifying what was done and said and linking it back to ideas, values, and norms that that person may have held. Okay, wonderful. So that gets us through the first 2 lenses that we're talking about when we're thinking about how oppression is showing up. And then this last page here, this last page for this section is meant to help us think about that systems piece. And so what you're going to see up here, there's a few examples, right? We started out with just trying to highlight some of the ways that systems can unintentionally reinforce harm, intentionally or unintentionally, and reinforce oppression as it's showing up. So you've got a few examples. And then in this space below is where we're going to ask you to think about the systems that your client interacted with in the case example that you chose, and think about how those systems could have or did reinforce harm intentionally or unintentionally in this situation. So you'll see here, the first space is for your system, right? This is where if you're a healthcare provider or you're an advocate, you work in a law enforcement setting, whatever it is, that is your system, right? That's what we're referring to. And if you have questions about what we mean by systems, there's some context here to think about things like law enforcement, healthcare, addiction treatment, education settings, child abuse response, housing, all these different macro, big level things that impact, the ways that folks experience and walk through the world is kind of what we're thinking about here. And so here, your system is the first thing that we would like you to consider. And then think about the partners that you interacted with or that your client interacted with. So if you're a caseworker, let's say, this could be law enforcement, this could be the hospital, this could be the education setting where, the young person went to school, all these different places where there's a system that has power. How was that power used? And how could it have reinforced oppression, even if we can't necessarily see how it did, right? We also want to think about could. So if you can't think of, this X, Y, and Z did happen, think of what could have happened. Get creative here and think broadly about how our systems might unintentionally cause harm, or how we can imagine situations that may not be exactly lining up with the actual intention of the work going into it. Okay, so this next place here is a little bit of reflection, right? This is where we get to think a little bit more about how can we maybe shift some of the work. So we're going to come back to that goal that you identified on page 1 of this worksheet that we emphasized at the beginning there, because what's really important when we're thinking about how we are responding to or preventing violence and abuse is remembering to always come back to ourselves and think about how our actions are moving us either closer to or further away from the goal that we have in mind. And so putting that goal here is going to help us as we move into the next section of thinking about how you and the other service providers that you identified on this page could have set up a different experience for the client in your example. Use this to think creatively, right? Think if you had all of the resources in the world, you had all the time in the world, you had every opportunity at your disposal in your work, what could you dream of that would be different, that would have a better outcome for your client, and that might more intentionally think about the unintended consequences or the harm that could be caused, to really be sure that we're thinking about the impact and not just the intention behind our work. This is also a great space to think about not just dreaming and imagining what could be possible, but also what is possible within your work right now, right? What could you actively implement with the resources that you have, or think about with the supports that you have right now, right? How can we start thinking about shifting this work to think critically about the harm that could have been caused or was caused, to be sure we're not repeating those mistakes in the future. And then we really quickly wanted to give a little overview of prevention as we get to the end of this experience, because we wanted to wrap it up and bring it all back in a way that kind of put it all together and gave us some action ideas. So you'll see here on this last page that we once again talked about the different levels of prevention. This I talked about briefly when I went through that case example, but here it's laid out for you, right? What we're talking about at these different levels of prevention. And then we invite you to use this space here to think about how your current work is falling on the spectrum of prevention, right? Where do you currently exist in between these upstream, midstream, downstream prevention efforts? Where might your work already fall, even if you don't identify it as prevention, right? Like, we know that any work that's impacting child and family well-being, for example, has a role in child abuse prevention, right? There's a lot of ways to think about prevention, but really the goal here is to think about where could you situate your work now, and then how can you shift your work to be more intentionally inclusive of primary prevention efforts. And this one, it may be a little bit of a stretch or a challenge depending on your role, but it's always worth it, in our opinion, to dream of what we might be able to shift towards, or what we could include to make our efforts not only about responding to or addressing harm that's happened now, but moving towards an Oregon and a future that's healthier and safer for all people. And so that's what we invite you to do here, is to think about how you can align your work to be a little bit more involved with upstream and primary prevention efforts. And then the very, very last piece here is just asking us to think about the fact that violence and abuse are preventable, and each and every one of us play a role, right? We all have the ability to impact violence and abuse on some level. And so how do you see the ideas about fitting into your work? Think about, think about this question and imagine one or more ways that you can incorporate these kinds of things into your work, to give yourself some kind of action steps here at the end. All right, and that is the entirety of the original worksheet that we have here. Just for reference, once again, there's these 2 power and control wheels at the end that are accessible for anyone who might need them as you're going through this. But otherwise, thanks so much for tuning in as we walk through how to complete this worksheet.
Hey, it's me again. So now that Nicole Cunningham has given us that great overview of the original forms of those 2 resources, the case study and the worksheet, I'm going to go through a little bit of the changes that we made to the worksheet to make it specific to healthcare professionals, in particular thinking of SANEs, but really this could be used by healthcare professionals in many different environments. Okay, so this is the adapted version of that worksheet that we made for healthcare. You can see that we helpfully labeled the top with healthcare version and changed the color to a combination of our SANE program blue and the prevention green. So you can see we put a lot of thought into that. One of the things that you'll see, which is just very basic, is that we changed all of the language to just go ahead and be be patient instead of client, so that it was focused on healthcare. But some of the other changes that we made were more substantial. And so I'll walk through those with you kind of quickly here. First off, over here in the notes section where we were talking about privacy, I did call out that HIPAA is something that you're going to want to consider, of course, if you are a healthcare professional, whereas some other professions may be looking at it through different privacy lenses and different privacy restrictions. So especially if you're doing this maybe with your unit or with your SANE program team, just make sure that you're following those HIPAA standards there. And then at the bottom, we do have a link back to that original document because it really is meant to be used pretty widely and has a lot of broad applicability. We wanted to make sure that we gave you that there. Then the next thing that you'll see is on page 2 here. As Nicole Cunningham talked about, there's this nice little area where it talks about what types of this information do you have easy access to, and what might you not have access to, and how does that affect your interactions with, in this case, the patient? And so I just use this opportunity to really go more into what that looks like in the healthcare environment, and specifically how much of what we know, especially in advance of meeting a patient, is really tied to what's captured in the medical record. And thinking about the fact that we see the medical record oftentimes as this very impartial thing that just kind of captures facts as they are. And I think this is a good time to remember that medical records are created by humans, and humans are human. And therefore it tends to reflect a lot of the different things about prioritization and importance, and some of the biases too of the society that it's created within. And so what someone has chosen to go into the medical record and how they choose to have it show up in the medical record really affects what we see, and that reflects a lot about the values of our society. And so again, just remember that what seems like an impartial resource may not actually be quite so impartial, and just keep that in mind as you're working with your patient so that you can make sure to do a really nice, thoughtful, involved job with them. Also, it has a note here about, what changes about how you provide medical care when you know these kinds of things versus when you don't. And again, recognizing that, especially depending on the environment that you work in, you may not have a chance to figure out all of these different pieces of information. And we're not trying to say that you need every piece of this or to blame you if you don't have it. But again, just to pull out that people are such a mix of all their different identities, and that their experiences in life and in health are so tied to a lot of things that we often don't see. And just to recognize that we are oftentimes dealing with the ramifications of that as healthcare professionals, even if it doesn't have a chance to really show up directly in our care with the patient. So just keep that in mind. And, it might prompt you to lead your discussions with patients slightly differently, or who knows, maybe I've seen some really cool ways that medical records have evolved over the years to start to reflect a little bit more, whether it's, the patient's gender identity versus like the biological sex that may be captured in the medical record, or getting in preferred names or nicknames, or starting to capture important things about their spirituality or religion. All of those things really help us provide a much more holistic experience for our patient. Another place that you'll see a couple of changes is on pages 5 and 6. We used the same little mini vignettes here to look at some of the connections between different types of oppression and abuse. But you'll notice that where both of these little vignettes were captured on the same page before, we've added in a little extra page this time so that we could add in a question to each of the examples. And so the initial question in both cases has to do with how does the background that you're given affect this person's interaction with healthcare? And again, this is just a chance for us to really take some time and think about how our patients and their very complicated, multifaceted daily existence is captured in like very specific ways when they interact with us in healthcare, and sometimes in ways that don't completely, serve our interactions with them. Including just whether or not they're likely to seek out healthcare at all. There's a lot that goes into that decision that we will never see or be a part of. And again, not saying that you need to get like super in depth with each of your patients with that, but just remembering that that affects the interaction before you are ever even a part of it, I think really helps us give the most compassionate and sensitive care to our patients. And then again, it's a couple of reminders about what's likely to show up in the medical record, what's likely to be missed, and what does that say about maybe who is capturing that information, and what kind of priorities and values that reflects. And so you'll see that same additional question here with Vignette 2 with Avery. And I think that is something that SANES may especially identify with, this vignette, because so many SANES do come from the emergency environment, and because I was also an ER nurse in the past and have definitely done health checks for detainees that officers have brought in before taking them to jail, and just thinking about how, again, that affects the interaction from the beginning, especially because of some of those hierarchical power dynamics that exist within the healthcare system and the way that we interact with other professionals, like police officers, versus how we may interact with our patients. And so again, just kind of calling some of that out. And again, remembering that we hold a lot of power, as Nicole mentioned, just by dint of being in a spot where we are even thinking about these or evaluating all of this on behalf of our patient. That comes with a lot of responsibility with it too. And then kind of the last main area that you'll see some changes here is page 10, where it looks at the different types of prevention, and some examples of that. I think that a lot of times healthcare professionals don't think of ourselves as being involved in prevention, and I will, plead guilty to that too, unless maybe you're in like a primary care environment or really directly involved with preventative health. But I think SANES and emergency nurses and floor nurses and all sorts of other different professions within healthcare, we don't often think of ourselves as involved in prevention because we're coming in a lot of times after the fact and trying to manage a health condition that has already arisen. And so we think of ourselves more as response. And I think this is a really good chance for us to consider the fact that spectrum is this huge spectrum, and that health plays so much into every different step of prevention. And that means that we are all a lot more involved in prevention than I think we really realize or give ourselves credit for. And so this page is just, I think it's a really good chance for healthcare professionals to think about the different ways that we are involved there. And from talking with folks, across the state and also across the country, I think recognizing that can also be really helpful with sustainability sometimes, because the more that you see where you have agency and where you can affect the causes that you are passionate about at different points along that spectrum, I think can be really helpful for remembering the good that we can do in the work and really doing the best job for our patients that we can. So with that, I'm also going to make a little plug. We will be holding a live session, and that will be on the agenda, where you are welcome to bring your own case studies, and we'll kind of guide you through working on this. It can be a little workshop session. You don't have to share, but I think it's a nice chance to get to try all this out together and maybe learn from each other where those opportunities are available. And we'll also have another session available, if you haven't seen it already, on kind of that whole spectrum of prevention. So if that interests you more, we'll be talking about that a lot more in depth, and I encourage you to check that out. Thanks so much for attending this.